Oh,
Hey,
okay.
hey, Marco.
Thanks. First thing, let me thank you and the organizer for inviting me to provide some discussion of the talks. It's a big honor and it's great to be, in such a good company. I only regret I'm not there in person, but let's try to do what we can. Um, okay, let me bring up my slides. So what I'm going to do, and okay, can everyone see the slides? Is it working all right? Okay, great. So what I want to try to do in this half an hour is I'll try to focus a bit on the what I see as challenges, and of course, with each challenge, there's some opportunities and prospects for evolutionary psychiatry. Taking inspiration from some of the talks, unfortunately, I can't discuss all of them, or we'll be stuck here the whole afternoon. Uh, and I will point to some of the most urgent challenges I think the field is facing. And in doing so, I will refer briefly to some of my work, more as a pointer. So I'm not going to explain anything in detail, just point some I don't know, ideas or models or things that I think might be useful in this context. So, well, the first thing I think in emerging uh, from what I've heard today is this is not unique to the field of evolutionary psychiatry. This is all psychiatry and all the social sciences in a way, but in order to be compelling from a theoretical point of view, but also to develop or refine interventions for them to be actually effective. There's an urgent need for the field to really strengthen causal inferences. And this again, it's not unique to this field, but is a broader issue that's coming. Yeah, I think it's coming more prominent, and rightly so. Let me give you some, a couple of examples from things that have been discussed, um, where before we can be confident about explanations that seem, and might be, completely persuasive, reasonable, and even heuristically valid, we need to deal with the possibility of reverse causality. So what seemed like an outcome could actually be the cause. And Alfonso has raised some of these, right? This concern with regard to symptoms versus functional capacities. I have more to say about that. And possible confounders, including genetic confounders that we can finally start to address with multiple techniques. So for just one example is, very, very classic example that Alfonso presented is the morning sickness and the association with miscarriages and birth outcomes. Now that is definitely consistent with the possibility that nausea is having a protective effect. However, there are other possibilities, and these data don't discriminate between them. And there was a paper by Forbes in 2017, which I think makes a very compelling case that we still don't know. There's actually the possibility that some of the association is actually not causal. Part of it might be, but it's actually driven by fetal quality. So there might be screening mechanisms in the mother that basically adjust so the intensity of nausea is reflecting this kind of screening process based on hormonal production by the fetus. And that in turn is associated with miscarriages, but not because there's a direct causal association, because they're both reflecting the same kind of screening and quality assurance, let's say, mechanisms. So, and that's something, you need more complex data to test than just associations. Or take the fact that loneliness, no doubt, loneliness and social isolation predict a number of bad health outcomes, including mortality, including dementia, including depression, and so forth. Now, that's true. However, if you start to control for potential confounders, the associations tend to go away or at least become smaller. Now, this is one example of a study. Now, you could, I have my issues, for example, with including depressive symptoms as a confounder because there will be a more complicated causal network there. But before we can confidently state that loneliness is actually the cause of mortality, health outcomes, and so forth, we need to address the possibility of confounding. And when we do, the story becomes at least more complicated. For example, this is another study which also included, this is more recent, genetic controls. They stratified the sample into high, intermediate, and low genetic risk. And you can see that basically, when you include certain health behaviors and socioeconomic controls, the association for loneliness tends to disappear or become much, much smaller. This is not the case for social isolation, which at least remains significant, even if it's a bit weaker, even after accounting for possible, plausible confounders. Now, this is a partially genetically controlled study. So this is, very, very, useful data that go beyond mere associations. And yet, even with this kind of data, you have to keep in mind, this is a note that the authors made in the paper, that this is true, but it's still not enough to exclude reverse causation, in which there might be some predisposition that make people more likely to get dementia, and at the same time, or through some preclinical symptoms of dementia, make them more socially isolated. So and it's very complicated. Zooming in and being able to demonstrate one particular causal pathway versus another takes a lot of work, takes a lot of different, triangulating between different kinds of data. And I think evolutionary psychiatry should definitely embrace this and embrace this is one way in which the field should really embrace genetics. This is just one slide from a paper, and which looked at the polygenic genetic correlations of loneliness. And as you can see, maybe you can see it, it's very small print, but what they found was that loneliness has a very wide range of genetic correlations, which might indicate confounding, might indicate shared causes, might indicate something more complex going on. But the correlations include a whole bunch of other health outcomes, the mother and father's age at death. So there might, it's not just about the person's mortality. There's something about family transmission as well. There's some personality traits. There are also indicators of intelligence, socioeconomic factors, and so on. So this is definitely pointing to me to the fact that this association between loneliness and health outcomes is probably hiding a more interesting stories with a complex network of causal influences. And we want to unravel that also because that's crucial for, testing our theories and our evolutionary ideas about what's going on. Oh, and by the way, I'm linking to Alfonso here. Some of the potential, let's say, confounders or mediators or additional causal factors you have to consider are in the realm of functional capacities. So what determines loneliness, right? You can't just take loneliness as the independent variable, because how do people become lonely and socially isolated? There's objective factors, interplay between the environment and one's behavior, and there are also individual perceptions. For example, some people might have few friends, few social relationships, and still not feel lonely and isolated. So that's definitely something we need to address. Just another example of ways in which you can call into question traditional ideas about causality. We published this new paper on attachment and intelligence. And usually the standard model here, because you find not everyone knows, but attachment security to parents actually is correlated not just with social outcomes, mental health, and so forth, but also with measures of cognitive performance, like math performance, intelligence testing, and so on. And the standard model is that attachment security favors, say, cognitive exploration and promotes cognitive development and so forth. And in this paper, we reviewed evidence and present some arguments, and we suggest that the true model is probably a bit different, and it might involve some reverse causality effects in which differences in intelligence actually contribute to the development of security, and in particular of ambivalent and disorganized styles. And this can possibly contribute to explain some of the associations between parent and child attachment that are difficult to explain in other ways. Okay, but the causality is also a big deal in the context of therapy. And so we do one of the really big strengths of an evolutionary approach is that it gives you an incredibly rich model and rich menu of possible pathways for the origin of disorders, whether they are, let's say, true disorders in the sense of dysfunctions, or maybe more or less adaptive traits that we choose to define as disorders. This is my own version, right, of this. I try to make a little taxonomy of various kinds of pathways and contexts that can give rise to symptoms and things we want to treat. Now, there is, so I've been I think there was a presentation, I missed that unfortunately, but dealing with an evolutionary approach to the, let's say, the general factors that are involved in psychological healing, including compassion, consoling behaviors, restoring like social connection with the in-group, and so on and so forth, and how these general factors are involved in traditional forms of healing, but also in modern psychotherapy. Now, this is a great place to start, but we need to go forward, to go beyond this, and see if we can, depending on the specific models and hypotheses about the origin of different disorders, distinguish between the likely general non-specific factor that can help in therapy and what particular specific factors we might add on top of that. And the specific factors can be different depending on whether the person actually experiences a dysfunction in some evolved mechanism. Just to give random examples here, but if the symptoms we're observing are due to some kind of maladaptive learning, that suggests some particular, for example, vicious circles in which you learn avoidance behaviors in relation to some kind of threatening situation, and the avoidance behaviors prevent you from learning the safety cues and the safety behaviors, and you're locked in this kind of vicious circle. That's one possibility. Now, when that is the case, this suggests that beyond general, consoling and compassion and so forth, there might be some specific elements we can add to the therapy. However, if what we're dealing with is not a maladaptive learning, but a normally functioning defense that is just aversive and unpleasant, but still functioning properly, we want to do something different. So there's that. Placebo effects are very interesting. I suggest we should broaden the view to nocebo effects as well. So things when the expectations people create, therapists create in therapy, may actually make things worse. And then also Alfonso made a wonderful note about PTSD and the possibility of iatrogenesis. So when the interventions are kind of, in a way, mismatched to the process that give rise to the symptoms and don't actually make things better. And I want to emphasize that there's one thing that kind of struck me thinking about this. Here's one thing we should be really looking for, and it kind of and try to identify, is approaches to therapy that mimic the effective non-specific components. So they do include, empathy, compassion, consoling behavior, symbolic means of, integrating oneself with the social group, all these things that, generally speaking, they are the container for useful and helpful interventions, but they happen to also include some elements that end up being counterproductive. So this is insidious when you have therapies that have or therapeutic interventions that mimic the good ingredient, the good non-specific ingredients, but add some ingredients that are actually maladaptive. And I think the PTSD example might be one of those examples. All right. Next big challenge is the challenge of mechanisms. And of course prediction. I can't read my own titles. So, okay. Prediction is, and this is just going to be just a brief note, but I think this is going to become more relevant and more pressing in the coming years. Researchers in many fields, including evolutionary psychiatry, are starting to make more use of machine learning models. And what these models often do is they're optimized for reliable prediction. You want a model that doesn't just spit the data at hand, but it's going to be to have the power to predict new data and do so reliably without overfitting and so on. Now, it is just one example from one of the, I think one of the presentations, in which there was the lasso is a technique for selecting variables and regularizing variables in a way that maximizes prediction. Now, this is great. These techniques are very powerful, but many people who are starting to use these techniques tend to forget or not internalize the fact that when there are trade-offs. When you optimize a statistical model for prediction, you may actually be sacrificing some aspects of explanation. So, and I don't have time to explain what I mean here. I'm just going to refer you to a paper that I recently published about what I call the prediction explanation fallacy, which is something that's happening more and more in scientific disciplines, where people start using prediction optimized models because they have certain desirable features, but then they immediately jump and use the results of the model as a support for explanation, for example, for testing between different hypotheses. And that is something that can be very tricky because just to cite one example, one way to optimize models for prediction is actually to hypersimplify them and remove some potential relevant variables because they, even if they are involved in the process and they should be part of a complete explanation, from a statistical point of view, they don't add to prediction. And that can lead to, for example, multiple models of the same thing, each of them including different variables. They all predict quite well, but they suggest different explanation of the same thing. This is not a paradox. This is just a consequence of how these methods work. And I think people should become more aware of not just of the strength of predictive modeling, but also of the possible limitations with respect to theorizing and explanation. Mechanism. And I'm glad to see, this was really in many presentations, you could just kind of detect the subtext here that we're always, as evolutionists, especially when we want our theories to have some relevance to the real world, we need to walk this narrow road between ultimate and proximate explanations. And if you only focus on the ultimate level of analysis, you can only get so far. At some point, you really need to integrate that with a view of mechanisms. And so let me suggest a few ways in which we can do this. So the first thing is, I've been working toward this. This is a lot of my recent work. I think especially this is relevant to personality, but it's just as relevant to clinical psychology, psychopathology, and psychiatry. Emotions, motivations, and moods are not separate things. They are elements of an integrated network of self-regulation. And so what we really want is a model of motivation that is expanded to give us a map of how emotions work and how mood works. Let me give you. So some of the presenters showed this diagram generously. It's a kind of diagram that I think clinicians can relate to, because it's a way to kind of provide a broad brush map of what people strive for. What are our motivations? What are our sometimes conflicting drives and priorities? And in this chapter, I'm showing here, I'm using this model as a starting point for something a bit more ambitious, which is the idea of putting motivational system at the center of a more complete model of emotions and mood regulation. So the general idea here is that emotions, essentially what, they do a bunch of different things, but their specialty, right? The special function, evolved function of emotions is to provide coordination to the many psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that make up the mind and brain. So emotions as coordination mechanisms. That's a good starting point. My argument is that motivational systems, for example, the attachment system or the status competition system or the mating system, however you want to slice the domains, the various domains that make up motivations, what they do is essentially work as another layer of coordination, as second-order coordination mechanisms that coordinate the activation and deactivation of specific emotions. And for each motivational system, you don't have just one emotion associated with it, but multiple emotions that are deployed conditionally. So, for example, the attachment system can activate different emotional, let's say, responses depending on whether the caregiver is present or is away, whether there's danger. So, and it can range from safety and warmth to separation anxiety and despair. So the idea I'm proposing is not new. Okay, it's in Bowlby, I think, was the first to really kind of nail it. But this is something that has been ignored in emotion psychology. So the psychology of emotions is largely kind of unaware of the work on motivation and vice versa. The idea that motivational systems, what they do is they serve as organizers, like second order organizers for emotions. And also, and this I think from a psychopathological perspective is something we could really know. It's a starting point to work on. This model proposes the first, to my knowledge, is the first principal distinction between moods and emotions. So the idea that what moods are, the mechanisms that give rise to moods are integrated mechanisms that receive the information from multiple motivational systems. And also things like the immune system, metabolic inputs, and so on and so forth. So they serve as integrators of what's going on. Are we reaching our goals? Are things getting better or worse, and so forth? And that's something that's already present in the current models of moods. But the idea here is that what mood mechanisms do is what they do is regulate the activity of multiple motivational systems at once. So what moods do, they change the motivational profile of the person. And in this way, indirectly, they change the kind of emotions the person is going to experience. But in this model, moods and emotions are not just continuous. It's not just one extreme and the other of a continuum. The idea is that moods and emotions are actually at different levels of a hierarchy of control. And what's in the sandwich between them are motivational systems. I think this perspective is extremely interesting, but of course, I would say so, but I really do. So one implication is that much of what goes by emotional regulation can be reframed, I think, very usefully as motivational regulation, and explore some implications in the chapter I just linked. But also, it's an entry point to take our current models of moods and make them a bit less rudimentary. Because, of course, mood is everywhere. And in psychiatry and psychopathology, you have mood disorders, there are mood symptoms associated with all sorts of different syndromes. But if we go and look at even in the evolutionary models of mood, for example, this one by, Nettle and Bateson proposed one of the more kind of sophisticated approaches to moods. It's still a bit simple, right? Because basically you have, four kinds of moods. You can be positive, upbeat, or depressed, or anxious and depressed, which kind of okay as a first approximation, maybe. But it's interesting that we have an incredibly nuanced taxonomy of emotions, which are getting more nuanced. As, for example, if you're conversant with basic emotions theory, Ekman started with his six basic emotions, 6 or 7 depending, and now scholars in the field, they're proposing lists of maybe 20, 25, 30 basic emotions or candidates. So the field of emotion theory is coming out with an incredibly interesting and detailed and sophisticated taxonomy of emotions. But when we talk about moods, it's just they're good or bad. It tends to be very, very simplistic. And so I think a model of moods as regulator of motivational profiles can actually help quite a bit. We should develop a refined taxonomy of moods, and I think we have the tools to do that. For example, so one thing, just I was suggesting this in a recent conference. Think about mania. Mania.
Sorry, you got 5 minutes, okay, Marco?
Yeah, sure. I'm good. Are you lying to me as well?
Okay. No, you're fine.
No, I'm kidding. So mania is associated with upregulation and downregulation of many different motivational states, from stages, mating, affiliation, but also things like hunger and so forth. And we should start really trying to map moods, both typical and atypical mood states in terms of their motivational profiles. And I think we can make headway. And just to show you one thing, there's been some evolutionary work on what the authors call lassitude, which is they call the emotion of being sick, the affective but also bodily, let's say, coordinated profile that people get when they have an acute infection, and which of course might be related to depression in interesting ways. But the thing is, this kind of, as you can see from this little scheme here, the idea is that lassitude, receives some certain inputs, integrates cues about multiple inputs there, and then it affects a range of essentially motivational systems, from appetite, right, mating and libido, threat avoidance, care seeking, and so on and so forth. In my, from the perspective of the model I briefly presented, lassitude is not really an emotion, but is actually a mood state. And we should do the same kind of mapping job with other mood states. Okay. There's another important thing here. I'll briefly cover two more mechanistic domains. One is the domain of instrumental goals, which is, mating and reproduction are kind of ultimate goals, probably unrepresented. This is what drive, motivational systems. But organisms also pursue practical goals and sub-goals. For example, making a nest, building a nest is an important step to reproduction, but it requires a hierarchy of goals like, finding the material to build a nest, going back and forth, building the nest, making sure it's solid, blah, blah. Now, these goals are what fills the day-to-day life of organisms. They are connected to basic motivations, but they're not the same thing. And I've been proposing, this is the paper, I'll go very quickly, so I'm giving zero details, but if you're interested, I've been trying to link the theory of emotions and motivational systems that has been developed in evolutionary psychology to a model of how practical goals are regulated. And the outcome is what I call a general architecture for motivation. Let's not go into the details. So one thing this architecture does is clarify the role of emotions as a link between these core biological goals of motivational systems and the way people regulate instrumental goals. And it adds one particular kind of system, which I call the instrumental goal pursuit system, or IGPS. And this system is like, you can think of it as a programmable motivational system that takes moment-to-moment goals as the input. And the working parameter of the system, like the depth of the goal hierarchy, the flexibility or rigidity of the goal hierarchy, persisting in the face of failure, and so on and so forth, it's another place besides motivational system to look for crucial functional capacities that can affect mental health and psychopathology. And I want to briefly end on mismatch, because we've been hearing about mismatch, and it's a powerful explanatory concept in evolutionary psychiatry. We're talking about mismatch a lot, but we're still lacking an exploratory, like a mechanistic explanatory model of how mismatch works and what are the many possible ways in which mismatch can actually arise. And so this is something I'm presenting it here because this is something I started to work on right before COVID. And that was one of the victims of COVID for me, because I had to stop working on this. I presented this to one conference and that was it. But if someone is interested in maybe taking it from here and starting to think about this a bit more deeply, I'm potentially open, to collaborations. I started working on a very simple, schematic model of what are the key ingredients in a plastic response. Okay, so what are the ingredients of plasticity and where can mismatch arise? Using a taxonomy of mismatch that I think is very useful, different kinds of mismatch proposed by Nathan Kaufness. Basically, you can link different kinds of mismatch to different places in which this kind of little mechanistic model can work or fail to work. And this is actually something that gives you tremendous leverage because, for example, you can distinguish the case of so-called evolutionary traps, like, whatever, sweet foods, we know, high calorie foods that are, not nutritious, but just overfeed you. For example, you can clarify the role of feedback mechanisms in specific kinds of mismatches. And it's going to be different, for example, from cases of mismatch in which there's a so-called outcome failure. So there's a response that fails to bring about the evolved response, and so on and so forth. So just by taking a little step beyond the generalities and trying to develop a little mechanistic model of how things work, you can start making distinctions. And for example, if we can distinguish between different kinds of mismatch scenarios, you can also identify the key points where you can find the risk factors, but also you can focus your interventions. And with this, thank you for the attention.
Thank you.
I hope I provided some food of thought.
Okay, thanks so much, Marco, for finishing off the session. That's it. Thanks everyone on Zoom for joining.